Yeah, you
Okay.
you can actually do it automatically every time in the Zoom settings. That's what I typically do. If some meetings I need to record all the time, I
Yeah,
just change it in the Zoom settings, so it's typically starts recording.
yeah. So I kind of don't do that because I always ask permission from everybody at the every call, because sometimes people come and they don't know. For example, people who are coming new, they don't know that maybe this will be put up on YouTube. So if they share unknowingly anything that
Oh,
they
okay,
is
got
little
it.
sensitive. So I kind of always ask. That's why I don't automatically start the Zoom recording.
Okay.
But thank you for reminding me of that. And otherwise, I would have forgotten. So with that said, let's get going again. So we talked about agenda bashing. The main thing we talked about in agenda bashing, I apologize for repeating, is the fact that the SuzieQ Enterprise Edition has had a few deployments, and the latest one has been pretty large, 1,500 devices across the world, and it's going pretty well. And so if people want to know more about the Enterprise Edition and how it helps your enterprise, feel free to reach out to me. We're working on things like data sheet. Don't want to spend too much time on the community meetup talking about the enterprise edition. We'll have separate calls for that. We talked about Ask SuzieQ. Two questions came up: whether there is the support for cabling check in SuzieQ, the way Cumulus's prescribed topology manager does. And the answer was no, it doesn't have it in the open source. It's in the enterprise edition. Please put in an issue request. And the second question was, there's an long asked for feature to doing a diff against the configuration, different snapshots of configuration. I said that I know, and I want to work on it and get to it. Hopefully before the summer is here, I'll hopefully add that, was my statement. Moving on, we talked about debugging the polar, and we were starting there. So what issues do people see with debugging the polar? Debugging the polar, the primary issues are grouped into three. The first one is pre-deployment. Before you even get started, you have a bunch of questions and you want them answered. The second question is about connectivity failures. And the last one is parsing failures. I've kind of walked through each one of them separately because the questions that come up in each one is different. The set of questions that come up in pre-deployment typically are, is my device supported? Will running the polar harm my network? What credentials does SuzieQ need to connect? And is the polar deployed on a powerful enough machine? People generally ask, what are the minimum server spec requirements? Some people don't ask, they just directly deploy it. And so I thought we should kind of walk through each one of them step by step. So is my device supported? So if you go to the SuzieQ documentation online, read the docs online. If you type SuzieQ, read the docs, you should get a hit. SuzieQ shows up pretty high on search lists. So meaning on the very first page, it's either the first or the second hit. So you should be able to get access to the information quite easily. If some of you who are using Bing or ChatGPT want to ask ChatGPT or Bing, that also works now. But in any case, if you go to that, read the docs and look at the tables over there, you will get the list of devices. Rather than show you one over here that will get outdated pretty quickly, I think looking at that and making sure your devices are supported and the tables that we support, the services that we support, that's a good place to keep. We keep that updated pretty frequently. Will running the polar harm my network? That's an interesting question. The primary problem is it depends very much on what your network devices are. Originally, especially if you've got a Junos device, I would say you need to walk through step by step, and I will talk about how to do that as we go through this. But it is important for you to be able to watch for certain things. So for example, if you've deployed, you're trying to test this against a backbone network where you've got the entire internet routing table deployed, and you're trying to, and many of them are Junos devices, and you're trying to pull down the routes, it may not work very well. In some other situations, it may be that your device is really underpowered, and by default, our polar runs periodically every minute. So you may want to adjust the periodicity of the polar before you proceed. How to do all of this is on the website, in the read the docs, so you should be able to follow that quite easily. But the important part is that in general, SuzieQ should not harm your network. If you set the polling frequency correctly, if you look for your device, it should not be a problem. If you are running against a Junos MX, which is assumed to be a backbone device, we don't pull down the routing table by default. We have to do things to actually pull down the routing table. So the latest SuzieQ will not harm. We do our best to make sure that your network is not harmed by deploying SuzieQ. But let's talk about how to do more than just our attempts at ensuring. How can you do the things to ensure that as well in the next few steps? What credentials does SuzieQ need to connect? SuzieQ only needs read credentials. We do not modify any configuration. We do not do any writes to the device. It's a read-only access. So we do need read-only credentials to connect to the device. I'll stop here and see if people have questions with what I just said. Was there something in what I answered that did not satisfy you completely with the first three questions? So is the polar deployed on a powerful enough machine? I used to answer that frequently on Slack. Instead, what we now do is when you fire up SuzieQ Polar, and this is going to be in the next version, it is not in the 0.20.1, which is displayed here. It's actually going to be in 0.21, which will hopefully be out by the end of March, I'm thinking, or maybe the middle of April. Will display this particular information, which, oh no, I'm sorry, this is actually there in 0.20.1 today. What you will get is this information, which tells us right away in the log, what is the machine on which it is deployed, how many cores it has, what is the CPU load on the machine, and what's the total amount of memory that is used and available. We also print a warning if you are deploying it on a machine that is less powerful than we think is minimally required. The problem, of course, or the situation, of course, is your mileage may vary. If you're testing SuzieQ against one lab device, it's not a problem. That's pretty easy. It should run on much lower specs than what I've displayed here. The minimum specs we ask for is i7-like processor, a modern i7-like processor with 4 cores and about 16 GB of RAM. This processor is my laptop. It's more powerful, but this is not the minimum requirement. But if you don't meet the minimum requirements, we display a message which tells you that we are not meeting the minimum requirements, and then you can pay attention to that. So that's the first thing we have done. We are working on making other things easier as well. For example, we want to add some support to be able to show the supported devices and services by running a command rather than going to the web page, but we'll get to that next. But these are the 4 pre-deployment questions that people ask. Is this powerful enough? Will it harm my network? Is my device supported? And what credentials do I need? Hopefully those have been answered in a meaningful way that people can act on it and go on to the next phase of the deployment.
I think I have the same question which Rick has posted in the chat, Dinesh.
Someone posted something in the chat. If you could just repeat the question for me. I don't see the chat here.
No. Does this take into account the amount of devices it's polling for the memory and basic requirement, right? Based on the inventory, we say that whether this is minimum config or not.
No, we don't do it based on the minimum on the inventory. We just basically have a simple check right now, but that's a good point to check the inventory. The difficulty with the inventory is not just the inventory, right? So let's take a simple example. Let's assume that you've got 10 devices, which are data center devices, and they are, a simple 10 node network with leaf and spine. The amount of routes you have might be simple enough that it makes no difference at all, and life is easy and it just works. For example, if it's a Cumulus device, I've had people deploy up to 300 Cumulus devices on their laptop with 4 cores and 16 GB of RAM. On the flip side, if you've got Junos and their backbone, and there are even 10 of them, the amount of data we have to pull down is so much that the amount of RAM may not be sufficient. And I can't say that information directly just off the inventory. I will need to look at the data as well to be able to say it. So the answer is a little more complicated. So that's why we stuck with the simple answer of saying 4 cores, 16 GB. We can talk. Other than that, if things don't work, maybe you want to look at your spec.
Yeah, no, typically we have done this in different products, and the way we do it is just right. So you fill in something you need not by inventory, the number of routes you expect. You just punch in a default table kind of thing, and then it gives you, this is the memory RAM you need for this one, right?
Got it. What you are asking for, Senthil, let me play back what you're saying, is instead of kind of you printing a spec, why don't you have a kind of like a wizard or a questionnaire where people will ask you can ask the people to enter a bunch of information such as how many in what's the inventory, what is the thing, and then we can give a
what's the max approximate, right? You say that, okay, for
got
this one, this is the footprint you want, right?
I
So
think
that's how we
a
typically
good
give.
use case. I mean, that's a good way to think about doing that. Primarily because of the fact that one of the things we want to do is make people who want to try SuzieQ out as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. So if it's something that doesn't work for you, you should be able to figure that out pretty quickly. For example, if a device is unsupported, we print information right away saying that this is an unsupported device. But doing what you're suggesting from a server spec is a nice point. Well, make it that. Thank you.
I think that's a big point, though, to be fair, because I get asked that quite a lot. Like the main thing I'm always asked about SuzieQ is the amount of resources, right? So I think that'd be great, especially if you like a bit like they do with VMware, right? So it just makes the designing a lot easier.
Yeah, that's why I picked the minimum and said 4 cores, 16 GB. Don't know anything, 4 cores, 16 GB.
Yeah, that's cool, but like you were saying, it doesn't take into consideration the state, right? So you kind of need something.
Yeah. I think that's why I agree with Senthil's remark that that's a good thing to have, a kind of like a wizard that you could probably do it at first time, or it's just something that runs independently. You just enter it and it tells you the same.
You don't need to have a wizard and all. It's a simple thing.
Say that. I say wizard, but it's not like it's some fancy thing. Yes, absolutely.
Just one more question, sorry. Has there been any changes in the last few versions? I would probably say since, I don't know, 17, 18, in terms of any enhancements to reduce the amount of memory that the Polar uses? Or is it the same kind of...
It's the same amount of memory. We found a leak in one of the libraries that we use that caused us to use a lot more memory than necessary. And in 0.20.1, we fixed that leak. It's not in our code. It is in the code that is in one of the libraries. Actually, it's a library that you were asking about yesterday, Eric, which is the date parser library.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah, it's an open issue, and it was only, and by the way, it only manifests if you do one particular thing. It's not like the library is buggy. It's a beautiful library. We use it all the time. But that one particular thing is an open issue that is on their website. That's an open issue, and it's not been fixed. So we just avoided using that particular feature. It wasn't very hard.
Cool.
It's when you have got relative time. So other than that, there has been no change to increase the memory. Now, to be clear, the enterprise edition uses, as I was telling James in the pre-call, the enterprise edition uses 80% less memory and 50% less CPU than the open source version, and it scales very well. So 1500 devices, for example, on the open source would be a little hard. That is the amount of memory you would need might be a lot more than even a VPC server can offer because of the amount of state we need to store.
Okay, cool. That's good to know. That's quite a big thing, isn't it? So yeah, that's good. Yeah, okay.
So that's one of the things. We started from the same spot, but then we found that as we needed to scale, especially for large deployments, we found that we had to make a bunch of trade-offs and a bunch of different enhancements that we decided make sense in the enterprise. And so those parts are there in the enterprise. So if you're doing anything more than a few tens of devices, then looking at the enterprise is the way to go.
Cool. Okay, great. Thanks.
But just to be very clear again, I never want to do a bait and switch. So SuzieQ open source will remain in active development. I will continue to add features to it. It's not something that I use to drive people towards the enterprise.
No worries. Cool. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions?
One thing I'm coming up. Initially, Andrea helped me a lot to set up SuzieQ at the time because it was initially when we started during the time.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah. Long time ago, right? So is there any guide? I haven't gone through SuzieQ recently. So is there any guide or something you guys already have, somebody who wants to deploy SuzieQ immediately? Or Some
No,
README?
that's another good point. That's part of why I was doing this, is there is no kind of walkthrough guide for somebody to do all of that stuff. And so in the spirit of open source, there is documentation to let you do a bunch of things, and a lot of people have deployed, but there can be obviously a lot more in terms of also the feature set. For example, a couple of maybe in November when I did the Ask SuzieQ thing, a lot of people asked a ton of questions because they didn't even know some of the features that SuzieQ had. And so I intend to write more posts to explain some of that and then walk through a deployment guide, what you're asking for Sentinel, but today it doesn't exist.
Okay.
Any other questions? But of course, again, this is part of the reason why many of the people engage us on the enterprise edition as well, but separate discussion. Okay, moving along. The first question that people ask when it comes to, okay, I've done everything and I've deployed it. The first thing they say is, oh my God, my poller is hanging. Is it working? I think my poller is hanging, because what ends up happening is we print a message that looks similar to this and it just stops there. Nothing is happening. It's just sitting there. No, the poller is not hanging. The poller is working. The poller is meant to be deployed as a daemon. So, you know, you would do an ampersand on it, a no-hop and an ampersand on it, or you would just dedicate a window and just leave it running there, depending on your particular circumstance and situation. The poller isn't hanging, it is working. If there's any error message that will show up directly on the std out, or if you're directing everything to a log, then you can take a look at the logs, and that's where everything will be. So if this is all that is printed out, this does not mean that your poller is hanging. Everything is working as expected. So the next question that people ask from the connectivity issue is, the poller is unable to connect. So the poller is unable to connect for various reasons that can range from, and getting into the specifics over there is harder. So what I wanted to do here was talk about a few specific things that you can point at, and the rest of it, how can you help us help you figure out what the problem is what I want to focus on. So if poller is unable to connect to a device, that is one of various reasons. One is, if it's a very old device, some of them use key exchange algorithms that are obsoleted and nobody supports them in the modern deployments. You need to add additional credentials. Starting from 0.19, we have added those additional credentials that we know. For example, we are deployed a lot against Cisco iOS and Cisco iOS XE, which are pretty old. Some of them are very old versions. And for them, we now work fine. But if it's unable to connect, the primary place to start would be the log. Take a look at the log and see what are the error messages printed there. The next thing to do is to go into the debug config and, into your SuzieQ config file and change the poller log level to info or debug. And that will give you far more information about why it is that it is failing to connect. A simple test would be to do SSH manually to that device and see if it works. Different devices behave differently to how people connect to it. And so it's important to kind of understand that just because traceroute works or ping works and your app, that to assume that your application will automatically work would be wrong. In the same way, just because your SSH works, to assume that SuzieQ would automatically work would be wrong. There are tons of different options for various situations, and you may be a person who needs to use one of those specific options. In general, if your SSH works, the poller should be able to connect. If you have given the right credentials, the poller should be able to connect. It's possible, for example, that your poller does not have a route to that particular network. You got to make sure, again, if your SSH works, that should work pretty much as you expect. The next question that people ask often is, hey, I'm getting authentication failure, but I'm pretty confident that the credentials I gave are valid. So two things over here. The first thing is, depending on whether the authentication mechanism relies on a backend server like TACACS, it's possible if you're using a number of devices that we are overrunning the TACACS server very fast, because SuzieQ is pretty fast. And a bunch of different networks have run into this problem where the number of requests we send are so fast that the TACAC server can't keep up. So we have added a bunch of options into the configuration, not into the configuration, into the inventory file to enable you to throttle how many requests we send per second so that the TACAC is not overrun. So you may need to enable that. And even with that, it is possible that your TACAC server fails. So there was one customer network where the TACAC server is so old that even by throttling it down quite a lot, it was unable to keep up. It would fail every now and then. They said that it is that particular TACAC server is on its last legs, that it will be switched out in the next 6 months. But for the next 6 months, it was still there. One of the things we very validate back to this point of whether we harm the network when you deploy SuzieQ, one of the things we don't want to do is lock you out of the network. Andrea can tell you how many times he accidentally got locked out, either because he typed the wrong password or SuzieQ had a particular error or there was some other user error that caused the credit authentication to fail, causing him to be locked out. So one of the things we do in consequence is if there is an authentication failure, we just stop. We never retry again. If it fails once, we stop. We never retry. In some particular networks, that is a little too severe. And for example, in this particular TACAC network that was running a really old TACAC server, they said, like, we have 3 retries before we lock the user out. So they set the number of retries in case of an authentication failure to be a higher number, and then the TACAC server worked. So if you have authentication failure, look at the log message. It may not have anything to do with your credentials. It may have to do more with how your TACAC server is able to keep up. Use the inventory options to throttle the number of requests we send to the TACAC server and increase the number of retries if that can be safely allowed in your network to also deal with really old and flaky TACAC servers. So that's about the authentication failure. Any questions on that regard? Okay, once that is done, some people have a problem where everything is working except for certain services. Certain services are failing. This is something that we have found very commonly with the route service. If you have got a route table that is pretty large, some of the devices for various reasons can take a long time to respond, and that causes us to time out our request, and thereby those services fail. For example, before we put in the fix to not pull down the entire internet routing table on a Junos MX with the entire internet routing table and a VRF, which had about 2 million routes, I think, took about 20 minutes to get the entire routing table. So that's a very, very long time. Now, some other users have actually much less. They're only about 100,000 routes. But they're having a version of, I think, Junos 5K that is really QFX 5K that is really underpowered server, that pulling down 100K routes causes their LACP to time out because they have not prioritized the appropriately what should be done and how it should be done. They end up creating a problem whereby even LACP starts timing out, and that starts affecting their real network. So from that perspective, routes, if services start failing, the first most likely culprit is routes. So the way to start that and validate that it's only the route that is failing and to isolate the problem would be to start turning off services. And you do that using -S or -X in the setup in order to avoid turning on certain services and make sure that everything is working. If everything is working at that point, then you can decide to focus on just the failing service. And usually people reach out on Slack channel at that time to us to figure out what is going on and to help them get through this particular problem. But if some devices are failing, but others are working, it's possible that it could be specific to that device. For example, one particular user had an iOS device that for whatever reason, it had nothing to do with their configuration. The user checked the configuration. They basically, that iOS device kicks out, logs off the SSH session after every 2 or 3 commands. It just keeps logging us out. And so we kept failing all the time. And so the messages would be the console or the log messages were populated with device unable to failing, connectivity failed, timing out, etc., etc. So when that happens, it's better for you to isolate that device or those set of devices and then either start a separate folder for them and then go take a look at how it runs, not a separate worker instance, but a separate folder so that it can go take a look at it. Though you probably can also make do with a separate worker, but then you would have to control how only a separate worker looks at those inventory files, which is a little harder. So I recommend starting just a separate folder with just those devices that are having this problem to be able to isolate what is going on. So to summarize in short, if you're unable to connect, there are a lot of different reasons. Authentication failures can be dealt with by throttling, by checking what is the cause of the authentication failure. It may have nothing to do with your credentials. It may have to do with your SSH config. It may have to do with the fact that the TACAC server is failing. In that situation, looking at the using the inventory config to control the amount of how many messages we send to the TACAC server will help reduce the authentication failure problem. If certain services are failing, isolate those services using -S or -X, and then we can focus on why exactly those services are failing. Typically, routes are the problematic thing in on some devices, especially if the number of routes are high. Most devices don't have a problem, but some devices do, and for those devices, routes is the first place to start. And if some devices are failing, but others are working, it may have something to do with the peculiarity of that device. Isolate them by removing those specific devices, starting a separate folder and looking at them. So with that said, I want to kind of switch quickly to actually the display and kind of show a demo of what I think is the right sequence of operations in order for you to play with the Polar the first time. But before I do that, any questions?
Dinesh, sorry for you said Polar and worker, but maybe for the new guys, they don't know the difference between the Polar and the worker. If you give maybe a quick explanation on what are.
Thank you, Luca. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So I mentioned Polar and worker. So basically the way SuzieQ works is our Polar is scalable. So the whole design assumes that you can fire up as many workers as you need. If the number of devices are a lot, you can fire up a lot of workers. So for example, someone ran with about 50 different workers. Typically about 10 or 15 are plenty good, but some of them have run with 20 or 25 because of the number of devices they have, and all of that works. But the way it works is when you start off the Polar, depending on the number of devices you have, you instruct the Polar to fire up a number of workers. So the Polar is really just a main device. It's mainly the controller, and all the other workers are the ones that are actually doing the work. Every worker is responsible for a device, and a device alone a single worker manages a complete device. You will not have multiple workers managing devices, managing the same device. So that's the difference between a worker and a Polar. A Polar is like the controller, and a worker is the one that's actually doing the polling, parsing, and writing the data into storage. Any other question? Okay, so switching screens. Where is that? So the new share. Yes. Can people see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Are the fonts big enough? Do you want me to increase the fonts?
Little bit bigger can help.
Is this better?
Yep.
Okay. So the first thing I recommend anyone to do if you don't know what to do with the polar is, you can always type SQ polar minus help, and you get the list of all the options you need. The minimum set of options is polar minus capital I, and followed by an inventory file. And that tells you what is the polar inventory file that you need to use in order to do something. So in our specific case, for example, we can use, I was using this inventory file called dia, which is basically a simple topology of in the diamond form. And you can then use this inventory to execute the thing. The first thing I would tell you is with the inventory or with anything you do is you always start with run once equals update. This means I want you to run exactly once, do what you do and stop. This is what we call a snapshot mode, meaning the polar does not continue to run. The primary benefit of this is it'll give you a bunch of different options. If there are things that are failing, you will see right away what is failing. If there are things that are broken, for example, we'll get to the parser error. You can catch those quite easily by just running it once for the most part. And the primary thing this will also tell you is how long it takes for a single run to be. For example, some people say, I don't need it to run at a frequency of 1 minute. If it runs every 10 minutes, it's plenty good. But in one user's case, they were running some old devices that were somewhat slow. The polling took about 15 minutes. So trying to run every 10 minutes is not very useful. Now, to be clear, SuzieQ does not start a new run just because you have said the polar needs to run every 10 minutes. We don't fire a second run on the 10th minute. We wait for the service to completely finish before we schedule the next run 10 minutes later. So you'll never run into the problem that many other people have had where, you have had so many services all fire up exactly on the period, causing a huge mess. So we wait for the service to complete and then schedule the next round. But just running it once will give you a quick time check about how long it takes. So for example, if I run this command, it'll tell you there are just 4 devices here. But once I am done, it'll finish. And I'm using fish as my shell, so I get the time. You could just type time and get the answer as to how long something would take. So I'm just going to wait for this to finish. But you can see even with 4 devices, sometimes it takes quite a while for it to finish. As usual, I'm running with a debug image. So hopefully this is not a question of hanging because the run once update had a bug. This is taking a lot longer than okay, there it finished. So this one says it took 1 minute and 9 seconds. So you know that one run is 1 minute and 9 seconds. So trying to schedule anything within a minute, so the default polling period of 1 minute is kind of pointless. So just increase this to 2 minutes or 3 minutes, depending on giving the devices a little bit of a break as well. So this way, you know what's to be done. If you don't know how to run this because you're not running fish and so you don't get that time, just start the command with time. And the same thing, and you should be able to get the time it takes for you to run a particular single run of the output, and then you can see what is going on. Now, along with this, one of the changes that's coming in the next release is if you go into the CLI, one of the problems we used to have with the older release is when you want to see, okay, so you've done this. So let's walk this step by step. Let me not jump ahead. So when you've done this, you say, okay, it's finished. How do I know what it's done? What tables, what data has it gathered? What data has it not gathered? A simple way for you to check what data it has gathered is to type table show. So if you type table show, you will get an output that tells you, all the tables from which we have gathered the output and what is the device count. So for example, let's take this particular one. File system. Only one device seems to have given the output for file system. The others have not provided any output. So you can say like, why is that? You would start typically with the device and you would say, oh, how many devices are there? 4. Oh, in my inventory, I had 4 devices. That shows 4. Perfect. So that looks correct. And you can type device show, and which I presume everybody knows now, to see what are the devices, and you will see what is their status. If there was any problem, you would see the status of this change. So table show tells you what devices data we have captured and what the output is. So now you get a list of what has been captured, if everything is working as you expect it to be. Device show tells you if things are alive, not alive. The next thing you do is you type SuzieQ polar show, and this tells you what services have been enabled, what the status of each one is. Now you will see a difference in this output compared to what you would see if you ran this, for example, on your device. And that is this particular status code. Today, we don't print the string, we print a specific number. That number is obviously hard for anyone to understand. And now in the upcoming release, which should hopefully be, like I said, end of March or the middle of April, you will have now a status string printed, which will tell you what the issue is for everything. So here you can see in one particular situation, privilege escalation failed, which is why we couldn't get the data. In the other situation, we could not run the command. The inventory command was not found. So CLS is a cumulus, and for cumulus, we don't have the appropriate command to gather the inventory. So the command is not found. In some other situation, in this particular situation, again, BGP command not found seems a little strange. But what I've done here, to be very clear, is I am just looking at the output as you have it today, because a bunch of people have gathered all the data, and using the data that you have, I'm trying to print the string. One of the other things that we'll be doing in the upcoming release is also to normalize the error code. So today, different devices return different error codes for the same problem. We want to map all of them. So we want to normalize the error code so that when we display this string, it'll look correct for you for the specific problem that you have. So that's the second thing. So you would run SuzieQ polar show. So let's stick with SuzieQ polar show. And let's say you can also narrow it down to a particular service. You can narrow it down to a particular host. You can do all of those things. So when you look at this particular output, you get a bunch of different pieces of information. The first piece of information is this gather time. What this tells you is how long it took for us to pull the information from the device. This is from the time we fired the command, that is, the command got scheduled, and the time the data actually came back to us. There are a bunch of factors which are involved over here, but if this number is very high, that is an indication that we may have a problem with respect to, for example, maybe you're running over an extremely high latency or a very low speed link. And so it's taking us a long time to gather the data. That should tell you that you need to adjust your polling period. The total time tells you how long it took after we gathered the data to process it and be done completely. So the total time is the data has been written out to the disk or has been scheduled to be written out to the disk. The write itself is not included, but it's been written out to it has been scheduled to be written out to the disk. The difference between these two times tells you how long it took us to process this. And all of this is in units of milliseconds. So if you look at this, it basically tells you 627 to 647. So it took us about 20 milliseconds to analyze this data. The service queue size is basically telling us how long it took while we are getting all the data back from all the different devices, how long it took us. The inventory queue will build up, the service queue will build up. As each of the nodes finishes its work, gathers the data, it hands it off to the service that's handling the data to go process it. If the servicing is taking a very long time, this queue will back up. So you will start seeing non-zero numbers for the service queue. The write queue will start backing up when the writer is overloaded. So how do you know if the processing is taking too long and you need to break up the worker? Well, the first thing you would do is look at the service queue to see is the service processing taking a long time. If the service processing is not taking a long time, so it's not the service processing that is the problem. You would look at the node queue. Is the node queue taking a long time? So in this particular case, we see that the node has got a number 3 all the time. So this means that all the devices are getting in a single shot, all the services. And so they are queuing up those services and trying to run them as quickly as they can. As long as this number stays low, it is equivalent to the number of services, that's not a problem. When this number keeps on rising, we have a problem with that. The 3 numbers over here, you want to say like, okay, this is all very nice, Dinesh, but none of us attended your talk. How do we know what these numbers mean? You can always understand everything by typing SQ polar describe. It tells you what the values are. We are fixing, so one of the questions, issues that we have is this says time, but it doesn't say the unit. We are fixing the help string to indicate that this is in milliseconds. So the next release should have that as well. So otherwise, it's just a queue length. So the node queue size tells you whether the node is unable to process the number of commands that is being given to it. And because of that, if this is going up, that means that this should typically, like I said, never go up too high. If it does, then you have to consider breaking your number of workers you use to a larger number than you have. Same thing, if the service queue is increasing, that means the processing time is taking so long that the data is coming back, but it's taking a very long time for the service queue to process. The last part is the number of bytes. This tells you how many bytes we get back for the data. And if this number changes, then that's another indication to you of what's going on. Now, if you take the case of routes, you take the case of MAC addresses, those numbers will obviously change. And they will change because of the fact that, what's the word for it? The number of routes will change, the number of MAC addresses will change, therefore that will change. But in the case of device, they should not change. All we are looking at is the output of show version string. Show version string should look identical time after time after time. So if this changes, that means that's an indication potentially of a parsing error. Make sense? We will change. Yeah. We have in the upcoming release, the status is no longer going to be a code, it is going to be a string. The gather time tells you how long it takes us to gather the data. The total time is the time it took for us to gather and process the data. So the difference between total time and gather time is the processing time. If you want to know if the number of workers you need to deploy is more, if the service queue or the node queue is higher than the number of services you have, so if this goes up more than, say, 5 or 10 or 15, then you need to start considering maybe you need to change and have more number of workers. Looking at the number of
just a configuration, Dinesh, the number of workers you mentioned, or it can be split into the number of workers you said, right?
Yeah.
Is it just a configuration you say?
Yes,
that? Okay,
it's not a configuration, it's a runtime option. So if you type the polar and you type -- help, you will see it's basically a number that you give here where you specify, where is it, -n, you should see it somewhere here, -w workers. So you just specify how many workers you have. -w2 will give you 2 workers. By default, we start with 1.
But this is all on a single system, right? So you cannot distribute to multiple systems. And
that's
we are
all
not doing
in the enterprise edition. Distributing it across multiple servers is in the enterprise edition.
Okay.
Yeah, but this is all only for a single machine. Okay.
Okay.
So to paraphrase again, you would use run once update to do a basic health check to check that everything is valid, that everything looks as you expect it to look, that you get a rough measure of what is the polling frequency that you're looking at. And therefore you can see that one run took me 8 minutes. So therefore I should set my polling period to be at least 9 minutes at a minimum. If the polling returns very quickly, then you know that it's run once is running really fast and it's not a big deal. Okay. And then you use that to control the number of workers, you use that to control the polling period, and also to understand by looking at the RX bytes, whether you have a issue. If this is 0, that means I'm unable to get any data for it. And if I'm unable to get any data for it, that is an indication of a problem. Maybe because the command that we are typing has changed. For example, when Arista went through its lawsuit, they changed a bunch of commands. They put in spaces where there were no spaces. They put in a hyphen where there were no hyphens before. So what would happen is those commands started failing. So you would see the failure show up in the log, obviously, but this is another way for you to check. Maybe you're not looking at the log because you fired the poller somewhere else, and now you're trying to use SuzieQ poller to be able to take a look at. Okay. Okay. So the next thing you do after you're done with all of this is you say, okay, I was able to run it once. I got the issue. I know what is going on. I understand what's going on, etc., etc. The next thing you do is you say like, hey, how do I know that all the data that has been gathered is valid? Is there anything in there that I don't like to see? Now, that is a harder proposition. We have got a bunch of checks in the enterprise. But if you want to go there, a simple way to go there for you would be to download the source code. And in the source code, you basically take the GitHub repository. In the GitHub repository, we have a bunch of tests for checking the parsing. We check that we have parsed all the fields properly. Now, that is not an entirely robust check because of the way the network is. We may not be aware of every single possible combination of devices that are out there. So, but that's a good, quick way for you to check if there is any issue. Another way for you to check is to be able to use the unique option. So take any column. So let's take a simple example. We want to look at the different types of interfaces or the different types of protocols. So if you say that route unique columns equals protocol, this will give you the list of protocols. If you see something in here that is not sensible, so take this one, for example, there's a blank here. There is something that is blank. A blank protocol is classically an indication of maybe there's a problem, but it could also be because it's coming from a Linux server or a Linuxy device that does not give us the protocol for that particular route, so to speak. So one way to check that would be to say route show, and you would say query string equals protocol equal blank. So this will tell you what is it that the route show query string protocol equals blank. User query invalid syntax. Oh, I know what the problem is. So this tells you that there are no that's because of the framework we use, the Nubia CLI. We need to put a blank at the end of it before we close the quotes, otherwise it complains. So this tells you that there is no particular protocol that has a blank, but there was a blank here. So indicating there is something that is wrong, and this requires further investigation. Same thing if you want to look at the interfaces, you type interface show and interface unique column equals type. And you see what are the types, and you look at this and you say like, okay, are these types understood? Is there a problem here? Is this something that I don't expect to see? So if there are things here that you don't expect to see, this is something that we would start by looking at and saying, why is this showing up as something that should not be? You can, of course, reduce everything down to one device. You can say hostname equals CSR1 and just see what it is for a particular hostname to keep things simple. For example, let's assume today, let's take another example. Let's say interface unique column equals IF name, and let's reduce it to the hostname CSR1. We look at this. Typically, we should expand all the interface names. We do not keep the shortened version of the interface name. If for whatever reason there's a parsing bug and we didn't expand it, reducing it to a single device and using unique will help you isolate and take a look at and say like, oh, there's a problem here. This interface name never got parsed out completely. Why is this a problem? When we do things like path or topology, if this is not completely parsed out, a bunch of checks would fail. Same thing, for example, let's take another example. Suppose we look at MAC table and you say like Mac table has a list of outgoing interfaces. What if we did everything right in the interface, but we failed to parse them in the Mac table? You are saying like, hey, I'm trying to look at something with a path. Path is not working well. So a parsing error would show up if you do a Mac unique columns equals OIF. You would see what the outputs are. If there is anything in here which is not fully expanded, if you say ETH1/1, we know that there is a bug. I'll stop here and see if people have any further questions.
I think this is great, Dinesh. It will help a lot of people.
Yeah, and I'll put this video up again. Thanks for reminding me, Senthil. I'll put this up obviously on YouTube on our NetEng Labs Slack channel. So YouTube channel, so you can take a look at it. So every single thing you would kind of run this kind of check by, you'd use unique. And for those of you who are like, hey, when I type it, I only see a small handful, I don't see everything. What you can always do is use set, and there are things like max rows. You can set max rows to display. And so you can set the max rows to 0, which means show me everything. Or you can, in this particular case, there are 4, you will see it. But if you have a lot of routes, a lot of things, it will basically show you everything. It will not kind of reduce it. So if you want to see 250, just change it to 250 and you will see what you want to see. But typically what I recommend people doing is using the filters to reduce what you're looking at, so you can actually get the data that you want and see what you're trying to do.
Do you have anything for flows also in SuzieQ today?
No, we don't have it in the open source. In the enterprise, we can integrate with a flow database and provide that information.
Okay. And again, in general, any inventory on general today from that power, optics, or CPU?
Yes, we
Also
do
is there?
gather all of that information. We do gather, we don't gather power, but we do gather what optics are present. I can't show you that, that the one to use for that is inventory. To type inventory show and you say type equals transceiver, you will get the output. So in this particular case, you can see all the ones that are absent, etc., etc.
Okay.
So you would get that information and you can see what the actual receiver type is.
Understood.
You get all the additional information here that way. This also covers power, fan, if you've got a chassis, then all the chassis line card information, etc., etc.
Okay.
Okay. So with that, I kind of want to stop here and say, again, use run once update. Do a check on table show to see what data has been gathered. The polar hanging does not mean the polar is really hanging. It's working as you expect it to be. And table show will tell you that. The other thing you can do is, is the polar running frequently? If I make a change, I'm not able to see the change. How do you know that the polar is actually running? Because we don't write data that has not changed. We only write data that has changed from the time we started looking at things. So how do you know that? What you can do is, so take SQ polar. So the polar has been running for a while now. So, oh, I think I stopped it, sorry. The polar, if you think the polar has been running for a while, if you say SQ polar show service equals device and view equals all, you should see a whole number of devices. So let's take a simple one. You can reduce this to hostname equals CSR1. You see that basically we'll be showing you one, we are stamping this time 1 every 5 minutes. So, and you can see that 26, 31, 36, 41, 46, etc. We are stamping it every 5 minutes. So if you see this, you know that it is working correctly. Another quicker way for you to do the same thing is to simply type namespace show. If you type namespace show, we'll tell you when the last update was, and that will give you an indication of whether this is working as you expect it to work or not. If this is not 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes, then we have a problem. Of course, it will only be 5 minutes if your polling frequency is less than 5 minutes. If your polling frequency is an hour, if your polling frequency is 20 minutes, then this will be updated every 20 minutes. Okay. Any other questions? So if there are no other questions, we talked about the parsing issues already. If there are no other questions, we come to the end of this month's meetup. Like I said, I will put up the video online ASAP, hopefully by tomorrow, if not sooner. The next office hours will be in April on the 13th. It's always on the second Thursday of every month at this time from 8:30 to 10. So I look forward to seeing you then. Please continue to ask questions on the Slack channels. Thank you for engaging. If you have nothing else, I think we can call it a day. Otherwise, I'm here to take any further questions people might have.
Thanks, Dinesh.
Thanks, Dinesh.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Does this help you, Rick, in
Thank you, Dinesh.
answer some questions?
Yeah, no, I think it's good. I think for me, it's remembering all of the commands, right? You kind of need maybe a cheat sheet or something.
Yeah,
But,
yeah. There are these
But no, it's good.
programs that print out cheat sheets, and I've kind of thought about creating one and printing that out. Again, lots of ideas on how to make things easier. Time is the enemy.
Hey, if
As
you have
always.
a bucket list, Dinesh, just ping me, which you want to take care of. Let me see whether how much time I can.
Sure. Thank you,
And,
Senthil. I appreciate that.
Hey, Rick, the other thing is if Packet Coders wants to do a cheat sheet, you could do the first draft, and I'm sure it'd be easier for Dinesh to come in and add stuff or correct stuff if you find yourself with a little bit of extra free time.
That sounds good. I'll send you over a quote, Neela.
Touche.
All right.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a
Cheers,
wonderful
guys.
week and the rest of the month. See you in a month's time. Bye.
See ya.
Thank you, Dinesh. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dinesh. Bye.